Welcome back to another hour of the Jeff Rense Program, live, coast to coast, and worldwide on the Internet. And now, here's Jeff.
Oh, that's fun music. And we're back having a very good conversation with Dr. Richard L. Thompson, author of many marvelous books, including his latest, Mysteries of the Sacred Universe, the Cosmology of the Bhagavad Purana. No, it is not a fish. It is a marvelous compendium of 18,000 verses, that some of which certainly may be 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years old. All right, during this hour, Richard, let's talk about technology. There are a number of stories out there that would imply that scholars, other than yourself, and perhaps yourself as well, have come to the conclusion that the Indians at one point, that civilization, whatever it was, had achieved some pretty grand heights of technological competence. In fact, they were able to fly and had other advancements that would, I think, boggle the average American's mind were they to know it. What did you find out about that technology? What are your best, and I know these are suppositions, but what do you think was going on back then?
Well, in this particular book, Mysteries of the Sacred Universe, I mainly have, you might say, stumbled across some evidence that people back thousands of years ago had pretty advanced astronomical knowledge. Now, there's no specific reference to the technology they used to acquire that knowledge. Of course, today we do that using telescopes and various accurate timing devices and so forth. We don't have explicit physical evidence that people had these things back in those days, although there are some intriguing hints. But we do have evidence that the knowledge was there. So basically what I found in the book was that there's evidence for the existence of what you could call an international scientific community existing thousands of years ago. Specifically, I found a connection between the astronomy in the Bhagavatam and the systems of units, for example, used in ancient Egypt at the time of the Great Pyramid. So this relationship is based on the unit called the yojana. The yojana is about 8 miles long, and in my book I show that based on the Bhagavatam and what it says about the orbits of the planets, the yojana should be about 8.5 miles. It turns out that this can be related directly to units that were used in Egypt, and it turns out that those units are based on accurate measurement of latitude and longitude. So the indication is that people had, in those days, both an accurate knowledge of the distances to the planets, and they were able to accurately measure distances on the Earth.
Huh.
So all the evidence ties together. So I could give some outline of how that all works.
All right, well, we can do that for a few minutes, but I would like to know if you came across anything that would underwrite, validate, underscore the contention that the Indians had flying machines.
Flying machines. Well, okay. Let's talk about that. I don't really discuss that in this book so much, although actually I wrote another book earlier, which is called Alien Identities.
Sure.
That book addresses the whole question of the UFO phenomenon. And basically what I observed in that book is that there's a very strong parallel between many of the accounts of UFOs that you find today and descriptions of flying machines from ancient India. Just to give you one example, in the Bhagavatam, there's a description of how a king named Salva wanted to wage war against a certain city called Dwarka. And so he acquired a flying machine. And it describes how, quite interesting actually, he did not have the technology himself to build that machine. But the description is that a being from another dimension, you might say, named Maya Danava, built it for him. So he loaded up the machine with boulders, tree trunks, and so forth.
Boulders and tree trunks. Okay.
Right. Things of that nature.
Right.
Heavy objects.
Right.
And flew over the city of Dwarka and dropped these things onto the city.
All right.
In other words, his bombing technique wasn't very advanced.
I got it. So he used this fabulous machine from another galaxy and dropped trees on his enemies. Okay.
Trees and boulders and things
somehow,
like that.
All right. Okay. All right.
So, and by the way, the flight of this machine is described, and it was said to have, it's compared with a firefly in the wind. If you imagine a firefly flitting about in a gusty wind.
Right.
So that's very much like the description of one of these glowing UFOs zigzagging about.
Sure.
Furthermore, the flying machine was able to disappear so that suddenly you couldn't see it, or it could appear in multiple images so as to confuse anyone who was trying to shoot at it.
In other words, photocopies of itself would be seen in the sky around it.
Right.
So to speak.
Holographic
images.
Maybe let's say holographic images.
All right.
Something like that.
Yeah, okay.
To confuse the enemy.
Yeah. All right, that's in-your-face stealth.
Right. Which is reported in the case of UFOs. There are military sightings in which a UFO suddenly splits into two. Things of that nature have been reported. So there are a lot of parallels between that story and some of the substantial reports of UFOs, especially those coming from military sources.
What do you think the likelihood that these were just campfire tales, mythological tales of flying machines? Man has always looked at the birds and thought about flying.
Well, it's of course hard to say.
It was impossible to say, but let's take a good guess. Do you personally think, Richard, that perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 years ago there were flying machines that may have been given to some of the Indians and maybe taken back in time? Maybe there were just sort of a loaner. Here's a loaner car. Have fun for a few months. We're going to take it back.
Well, if you look at the old stories, you find a rather interesting thing. Namely, that two kinds of flying machines are described. One kind, as I was mentioning, they're somewhat similar to the UFOs. The other kind is described as being more similar to what we think of as an airplane. Now, the second kind were said to be made by people, but the first kind, inevitably, it's described that they came from some other planet, some other world. Actually, the word that is used is loka. Loka means a world. It's a cognate of our word location.
Right.
It means a place.
Or locus, right?
Yeah, or locus. Because Sanskrit is actually quite closely related to Latin.
Hmm.
So,
or Latin is closely related to Sanskrit.
Yeah. They're both related. But in any case, there are these two different kinds of flying machines described. So the UFO-like ones, that is the entities that are glowing and that fly in a zigzag fashion and so forth, and which have various marvelous properties, those inevitably are said to have come from some other place. And of course there's that statement by Arthur C. Clarke that any technology that is high enough is indistinguishable from magic. So
that's a good statement, sure.
Yeah, so that's how these are described. But then there are descriptions of other kinds of flying machines, which are very mechanical and sort of down to earth. And there are many stories about how these were made by people. Now, a lot of the literature is just like modern-day science fiction. There are stories in which somebody builds a flying machine and goes over to the neighboring kingdom, and there's a whole plot that unfolds and so forth. So at least you can very definitely say that the idea was there of something very much like airplanes.
Well, we have certainly hieroglyphics suggestive of at least little paper gliders, if nothing else, or excuse me, papyrus gliders, if nothing else.
Well, let me tell you another story that is kind of interesting. Early in this century, there was a man named Vimana Shastra.
Who was that again?
His name was Vimana Shastra.
Right.
Well, he was...
I wonder what his nickname was.
I don't know what his nickname was, but he was sort of initially he was an uneducated village guy.
That's how I started out, Richard, so don't put those uneducated village guys down now.
Oh, I'm not.
I'm just kidding. We have to pause here. It's a good out for me to take a break, and thank all of you for being here tonight, and my guest, Dr. Richard L. Thompson, a magnificent book, The Mysteries of the Sacred Universe, available right now. His website, again, is sacreduniverse.com, located right under his name at the top of Rense.com. We'll come right back and hear the story of the simple fellow from the village and see what he came up with in just a couple minutes.
Program on radio. Now, here's Jeff.
And we're back. Dr. Richard L. Thompson, Sacred Universe, The Mysteries of, is the name of the book. All right, the simple guy from the village, Richard, what did he pull off here?
Well, what happened was that the story goes that he was dying of smallpox at a certain point. And his family...
How long ago was this approximately?
About the turn of the century.
Okay.
And his family had died. He was sitting by a riverbank dying of smallpox. And the story goes that a yogi came along, named Bhaskarananda, as a matter of fact. And the yogi cured him somehow. And he lived in the cave of that yogi with him for about a year. And the story goes that the yogi asked him, well, my young man, what do you want to do with your life now? And he said he wanted the benediction of having great material and scientific knowledge. So anyway, we don't know what the yogi did, but what happened is the man went back to his town, and he now had the ability that he would sort of go into a trance-like state and begin reciting Sanskrit as fast as he could talk, without any pauses or anything, which was quite something because he had never studied Sanskrit. And he would recite whole texts. So some people gathered around, and somebody started to transcribe what he was saying. And they transcribed apparently several different texts. Now, one of these was entitled Vimana Shastra, which means, Vimana means flying machine. So this was a book about flying machines, which purportedly came from the sage Bharadvaja Muni, who was an ancient sage. So I've read an English translation of that book, and basically it contains all kinds of information about how to build airplanes.
How accurate, how realistic is this information?
Well, the curious thing is I met a fellow down in Hyderabad, in India, who made a very careful study of this text. He said the standard English translation you can find is practically useless because it turns out that the Sanskrit words that were used in the text were very obscure, and he had to do a lot of research in order to find out what many of them meant. They were very archaic words. And he found that there were descriptions of how to make metal alloys, which would be used in building the airplanes.
Composites like aluminum, that kind of thing?
Yeah, like bronze, which is a mixture of certain metals.
A bronze aircraft, okay.
Well, I'm just using the example.
Gotcha.
There were various combinations. So he was an engineer, this fellow, so he went to a laboratory and he had these metals actually made according to the instructions, which he had translated. And he found that he actually obtained metals with the properties described in the text.
Really?
Furthermore, these were unusual properties. For example, one of these alloys was intended for making the plane invisible. And he found that the metal that was produced was extremely black, and you could shine a laser on it and practically nothing would reflect back.
I'm sure this little achievement wasn't lost on some of the military establishments in the world today.
Well, when I talked to him, he was actually hoping to get patents on some of these alloys.
This is how long ago you talked to him?
This was in 1994, actually.
Yeah. You might want to check back with him.
But in any case, so that's the story. The question then is, well...
I've heard that story before, and you're the first person with a direct link to the fellow that I know of. That sounds good. Merits a follow-up if you can do it.
Yeah, that's one thing I plan to follow up on. Haven't gotten around to it yet. But, so there it is.
The word Vimanas is the word. And does that have a Vimanas?
Vimanas, yeah.
Does it have a literal translation?
I'm not really sure. I just know the word has two uses that I'm aware of. Namely, one, it refers to a flying machine, and it also refers to the top of a traditional temple in India. The upper structure, the dome of the temple is called a Vimana also.
All right, someone just sent a JPEG of a drawing of a Vimana aircraft. There are two of them, and what they look like. We've all seen, I don't know what you call them, a little square house that you'd put on top of an elephant, and people would sit in it. It's a little throne room, so to speak, with a round top, like a dome top and a square, and it's open. Well, imagine a great golden goose with wings extended and one of these little, it's kind of like a cupola on top of it with four sides and 4 or 5 people sitting in it, and that is somehow attached, affixed to the back of the flying goose or swan, and that's what the drawing shows. So it doesn't exactly look like a high-tech aircraft, but the indication is they certainly had imagery when they talked about flying and how to do it. Okay, we'll be right back with Richard in just a couple of minutes. I'm Jeff Rense. Glad you're here. Coming up at the top of the hour, a visit with Barry Chamish live from Israel, the powder keg of the world. Okay. Nice music. Richard Thompson is my guest, talking about ancient India. Anything else in there about technology, Richard, that you've come up with during your research of those 18,000 verses? Technology, fiber optics, television, communications, cars, science. What else did you see that might give us pause to reflect upon?
Well, there's the whole idea of the flying machines is actually a common theme in the Bhagavatam. I haven't seen anything like cars. Pretty much ground transportation consisted of horse-drawn vehicles.
You don't think of horses in India very much for some reason. You think of everything else practically, but...
Yeah, well, in the old days, the traditional means of mobility and warfare was the horse-drawn chariot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and these horse-drawn chariots were big also. They had quite a few horses pulling them, and they were rather massive affairs, not just like the little one-man chariots you see with the Greeks and Romans.
Battle cruisers with half a dozen horses pulling them, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Interesting. Several archers and people in the back. Interesting. Now,
the stories about the bows and arrows and so forth contain some indications that more was involved than just an ordinary bow and arrow.
Mm-hmm. Such as?
Well, for example, the idea of sound-seeking arrows.
Sound-seeking arrows.
Yeah. For example, that shows up in the story of Salva's Vimana that I was mentioning before.
All right. Little hard to reconcile advanced technology like that with a bow and arrow, but maybe it meant, could it be that the arrow itself made a sound when it was fired through the air, shot through the air?
What it describes is that you can shoot the arrow and it will change course and go to where a sound is being made.
Maybe arrow then was an analogy for something else?
Well, it seems to be the indication. In other words, of course you can say it's an imaginative story.
Well, we had acoustic torpedoes in World War II. I mean, that's a technology that is rather primitive by today's standards, so okay.
But just like heat-seeking missiles.
All right, well, think of acoustic torpedoes in World War II. Same idea.
Yeah.
They'd follow sound.
Right. So this would be an arrow. You shoot the arrow in the general direction of what you're trying to hit, and if it's making a sound, the arrow homes in on it.
Have to be a pretty amazing aerodynamic arrow, as it were. But okay, that's fascinating. I think I've heard that one before too. Now, did you find the exact verse that described this? Were there several? 1, 2, 3? How many?
I think it's referred to in a number of places. Okay. I know it comes up in the story of Salva's Vimana.
Sound-seeking arrows. All right.
Yeah.
Might not have been bow and arrow arrows. Might have been something else.
Yeah, or perhaps the bow was just the launching device. So that's hard to say.
Pardon me, I've got to fire off my sound-seeking missile with this bow I have here. But who knows? It's very fascinating to contemplate the potentials here. It seems almost unlimited. What happened to ancient Indian civilization? Did it rise and fall? Did it ebb and flow like so many Western civilizations? Were there eras and epochs where societies and groups achieved heights of competence and then began to disintegrate like we've seen in ancient Rome and what we're seeing now in some of our Western countries? Well,
yes. In fact, that's one thing that I talk about in the book. I argue that there was a Dark Age period which actually came before what we call the classical ancient world and divided that from the still earlier period in which some of these more advanced forms of knowledge may have existed.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually some historical evidence for this Dark Age, both in India and in the Mediterranean world.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Mediterranean area, it began pretty much around 1200 BC and lasted until about 700 BC. And it was pretty severe. Just like in Babylon, practically the art of writing seemed to disappear for that entire period, which is very strange because...
Well, they went to computers then.
Well, they did something.
Yeah.
You see, the Babylonians would write on these clay tablets.
Sure.
And so they were very easy to preserve.
It's not out of the question to think of an alternate means of recording, you know. Okay.
Yeah. But the thing is, what happened was, you go back to around maybe 1100 BC or so, they were writing on clay tablets.
Mm-hmm.
Then they stopped for a few hundred years, and then they start up again after around 700 BC. Well, the historians say they believe that there was a period of barbarian invasions and general social breakdown during that time. And at the same time in Greece, the same thing was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And like in Greece, there's a division between the Mycenaean Greeks and the classical Greeks. And that...
Which Greeks?
Classical.
The first word?
Oh, Mycenaean?
Is that also pronounced Mycenium or mispronounced Mycenium? Is that the right M-Y-C-E?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to be sure I was hearing that word right. Okay.
Right. It's the same one.
Gotcha.
But there was a Dark Age period in between, and it falls in about the same time range. So now if you go over to India, it seems there was a Dark Age there also, but it looks as though it lasted a bit longer, actually. Because in India, there's what is called the Indus Valley Civilization, where they had cities with very accurate layout of the streets and plumbing systems that were quite advanced and so forth.
Plumbing systems, give me an example. Toilets, hot tubs, what?
Pipes.
Piped water into the house, sewage pipes, okay.
Yeah. A very organized system of pipes. After all, in a lot of old cities, basically you just have gutters running down the street for the sewage.
Right. They still do that in some third world countries, in many third world countries.
They do, and in India today too.
Yep. Well, you got 1 billion people there now. Goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in fact, the plumbing system in these ancient cities of what is called the Indus Valley Civilization were more advanced than what you have in many cities of India today. So,
that goes back to my question as to what happened, the rise and fall of social competence, as it were, societal competence.
Yeah, we don't know the cause. People speculate. They'll say, well, maybe a change in climate, a period of drought, which resulted in crops failing and people having to move out and so forth.
Or someone invented TV. That'll do it.
Yeah. So, no one really knows for sure. But what happened is the Indus Valley Civilization came to an end, and around 1900 BC, let's say, it came to its end, although it seems to have faded out gradually. And then there was a period in which there were no major cities, just villages. And that lasted until maybe 700, 800 BC or so. And then the cities began to be built again, and that continued down to the present. So, whatever this cause of the Dark Age was, it apparently affected the Mediterranean countries at about the same time.
We now know there was a Dark Age around the alleged time of King Arthur, and there was some kind of a massive mega volcanic eruption, or perhaps an astral body hit the Earth, which literally caused a Dark Age. They found that by studying the rings of ancient trees in the UK, among other places. So could have been a natural cataclysm as well, not necessarily a human cataclysm. But we'll be right back with the extraordinary Richard Thompson in just a couple minutes. get right back to it with Richard Thompson, our last segment tonight. And Richard, what about spirituality? We have the basic Hindu religion, but did you discover anything new, any new dimensions about that? Reincarnation, souls, multiple person, lifetime recall, and all that. We still have it, of course, practiced in India today. I remember, who was it that was tragically killed in the plane crash? The son of... can't remember. At any rate, there was someone who said that the fellow was reincarnated within a few weeks in a child in India, and the child was actually speaking at an incredibly early age and saying the things that only this individual would know. It was the son of the former woman Prime Minister of India. Somebody will email me, but forgive me for not knowing. But anyway, that was the deal. So what did you find out in all your work back then, looking at all of those amazing 18,000 different verses?
Well, of course, the Bhagavatam makes references to spiritual knowledge throughout the entire text. There's a lot of information there. For example, there's this term jati smara. That means a person who can remember a previous life. And that's what you're referring to here.
Right.
And it's observed that this does happen, especially with small children. Sometimes a child will remember a previous life, and it's possible to actually verify that by checking out the statements that they made about who they were previously. There's Ian Stevenson has investigated thousands of cases like that. But, of course, this was well known in the ancient India, and Jatismara is the word used to refer to it. Basically, the cosmology of the Bhagavatam includes astronomical information, which refers to what you can see and measure, and it also refers to other dimensions of reality. So the way the universe is laid out, I mentioned previously the plane of the ecliptic corresponding to this so-called flat Earth, which really corresponds to the solar system. So parallel to this plane, other planes of existence are described. And these include higher material worlds and also lower worlds. Then beyond that, there are transcendental dimensions of existence. So the idea was that the world that we see is only a very small part of the total reality. That also could shed some light on the whole question of where some of this technology could have come from or gone to, because the idea is that there was communication, and there still is today for that matter, between this material realm and some of these other dimensions of existence. And so communication went back and forth, and knowledge was also transferred.
Multiple dimensions, multiple planes.
Yeah.
Go to any whole life expo today and hear similar things.
Well, this is the original source of those ideas, I would suspect.
Let's hope so.
For example, consider the idea of the ether.
Which is now just beginning to creep back in through the back door.
Well, ether, in Sanskrit, the word is akash.
As in Akashic records?
Like an Akashic record, that's where the word Akashic comes from. Ether is considered to be the substance of space. That is, space is regarded as, instead of thinking of it as a vacuum or the absence of things, it's regarded as a kind of element or a substance. And as a matter of fact, matter as we know it, namely gases, liquids, solids, plasma forms of matter, and so forth, those were regarded as slight modifications of the underlying ether. So one way to think of it is if you imagine, say, the ocean with waves on the surface of the ocean, and the waves are very tiny compared to the vast depth of the ocean. So similarly, matter as we know it is like a very tiny little disturbance in the ether. And there are different patterns of disturbance, and you can sort of tune in from one to the other. So the idea then is that you could sort of, as it were, detune yourself from the pattern of solid matter that you're in and move through the ether and then enter into another realm of existence, which is also a pattern of disturbances within the ether. Just like you can tune from one radio station to another. So this is a basic idea. So if you look at the Bhagavatam, you'll find that this idea shows up throughout the text. And there are many different references to people being able to travel into these different realms. So that's one aspect of the cosmology.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to leave it up to you as to what you might want to put on the table here in our remaining minutes to further intrigue the audience.
Well, I'll just sum up briefly. The Mysteries of the Sacred Universe describes the cosmology of the Bhagavatam, and basically what you find in this text is, on the one hand, astronomy, which in quantitative terms turns out to be surprisingly advanced, and there are correlations between that astronomy and similar evidence for advanced knowledge in other ancient civilizations. But at the same time, there's also a transcendental dimension to this cosmology, as well as a number of material celestial dimensions of existence. So the material world, then, as we see it, was regarded in this system of thought as being only a very small part of the total reality. So,
what kind of breakthroughs might we expect? Anything? You've done all that work about ancient archaeologies and such. Anything turning up over there in an archaeological sense that might really put something on the front burner?
Well, there are many possibilities. Just to give one example that I mentioned in the book, there's this mechanical computer that was found in a shipwreck of a Greek ship.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
The interesting thing about it was that it's basically one of a kind. That's the only thing like that that's ever been found. And if it wasn't for that, no one would have any idea that people could build such things back in that time period.
Right. Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. I've got to link up somewhere on my website to that. What a remarkable device. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that a remnant of some much more advanced level of technology, or was that just some incredible quirk, a breakthrough at the time?
Well, one suspects that there must have been more of them.
Well, yeah, sure.
But where are they? Only one survived, and that was just by chance that it was found.
Yeah.
Because it was just on the bottom of the ocean in a particular spot, and some divers happened to find the shipwreck there.
Yeah, where did they all go, and why wasn't one left around somewhere? Why didn't one survive? Yeah.
And also, there's no documentation. In other words, there's no written text that talks about anything like that, and yet they existed. So that shows that remarkable technology can vanish from sight.
It does vanish very quickly, and for strange reasons. Maybe we'll find it's a great Sherlock Holmes hunt for clues and knowledge that really is our own and no one else's, and we should have access to it. Thank you for making that access available to us, Richard. I appreciate it, and congratulations on the new book.
Well, thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And take care.
Yep, bye now.
Okay, Richard Thompson, and we'll pause and come right back, take you right to Israel. We're going to jump right into the frying pan with the hottest, most controversial journalist probably working in Israel today, Barry Chamish.